Thanks both of you for doing this.
Sure.
Hi.
Michael, let me start with you. This is one of these stories you've spent a lot of time on, and it seems like if you're a storyteller, you're a reporter, in some ways it's no different than being a detective or a prosecutor in that you really loathe having ambiguous endings. It'd be nice to have this thing tied up of, okay, I'm gonna figure this out. The right people are going to come to justice, and that doesn't happen in this case. And I mean, at what point do you sort of come to terms with that of, look, some of the people who are in that room are never going to come to justice?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, for 25 years, I left journalism, and for 25 years, I've been writing fiction. And of course, in fiction, everything fits together. The puzzles are perfect. No pieces are missing. And to come to this story that is very unwieldy with so many characters and so many years of courtroom dramas and all that stuff, it had a lot of the ingredients that I love, but it was missing the final tie-up. But there was enough about this story that I thought had a kind of a societal resonance that I thought it should be told anyway. But from the standpoint of a guy who writes novels, this thing had a fantastic villain. You got to have that in Eddie Nash. I don't think there's been someone like him in LA as almost a public villain since he left the scene of LA. So it had that, and it had the other thing that I've always employed in my books or been fascinated by, and that is the relentless pursuit of the truth that comes through the detectives. And I've known a lot of these detectives for years before we did this project. And I've always been fascinated by them and inspired by them. So it had a lot of the stuff that I knew I wanted to be involved in. And you're right. And then it was Allison's choice, and she'll talk about this, to put me on camera and kind of be the guy asking questions like a detective, which was, I didn't expect that when we started this, but it was a fun thing to do. And I think ultimately, hopefully it adds something to it that I'm kind of leading the charge in the questioning of this disparate group of witnesses, cops, prosecutors, bad guys, everything.
Allison, that actually goes into a question I was curious about. This is a story that's been told a lot of different ways. I mean, it's most recently had a podcast, and there are a lot of talking heads. And what was your challenge of making this live in a visual medium, to tell this story in a way that was visually as interesting as it was if you just read it or heard it in a podcast?
Right. Well, we had, obviously a tremendous amount of archive from the time that really helps tell the story. We have the archive of the actual crime scene, the detectives discovering the crime scene, which is pretty amazing. And then, as Michael was talking about, I wanted him to be involved because he has longstanding relationships with these detectives and prosecutors, and even with Scott after doing the podcast. That, to get that on camera, those relationships with Scott, it's sort of the cat and mouse game, like trying to get the truth out of him. And with the detectives, it's their frustration of this case being so old and having gone through it so many times and still trying to put the pieces together and fit all the different parts together. So we wanted it to have that feeling, and have Michael take the lead on that, as it's a story that, has interested him for a long time. It becomes a personal quest.
Well, Michael, I'm curious, one of you mentioned about being on camera and having the relationships with these people. Are you going into this? I mean, obviously, if you're talking to Scott Thorson, you're going to believe maybe 15% of what he's saying at any particular time. But at what point do you get comfortable with, okay, this detective I'm talking to, this prosecutor, whoever it is telling me as much of the story as they can tell? I mean, because there's certainly a lot of trust involved on your part as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer is I never got comfortable with Scott. I mean, to me, he is very, his figure of curiosity is very interesting. But, at the end of the day, we actually lived near each other, but I would never tell him where I live. So I think that tells you something about my relationship with Scott. And to me, it was an interesting challenge to try to pin him down, and then try to, through other means, determine if he was telling the truth, how much he was embellishing. Granted, he embellishes things, and you can tell from the 5 or 6 different detectives that dealt with him through a couple decades, they have different levels of believing or not believing him. And that was all part of what I think makes this story really interesting. The idea of whether he was an unreliable narrator or not. And I think ultimately I could never catch him in a big contradiction. I thought I had a few times, especially when I was doing the podcast, and I did some explorations and so forth. And ultimately, I could never catch him in a lie. And as some of the detectives say, they could not either. And so I think he's the center line that runs through this documentary. And he is a figure of, he's a pretty fascinating figure. And I think that, kind of sustains the through line.
One of the ironies of this story, I think, is that sense of not being able to necessarily believe Scott, that it's a very complicated story, makes it interesting. I mean, if Nash had been convicted in that first trial, I don't know if people would be as interested as they are by this whole through story.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I'm sure we wouldn't have even done it just to be, and as you said, this story's been told a lot of times in a lot of different ways, but I don't think anyone's ever tied the whole thing together because it lasted so long. And so like books were published before all the information was even out there as far as like how he got to a juror and things like that. So there was a lot of new stuff that I knew we could bring into this, and with these two really interesting characters of Scott Thorson and Eddie Nash kind of being the anchors of it, and then you have these gumshoe type guys, shoe leather guys who go out and knock on doors and don't work computers. These detectives who were pretty relentless in pursuing this over time, and also passing the baton from one detective to the other as some retired and so forth. I just think it had a lot of elements that could keep momentum going through the process of this documentary.
Alice, I'm curious, just from a strategic point, when you're putting this thing together and there's all these stories trying to decide, what do I focus on, what do I not focus on, what was sort of the biggest challenge for you? Either a story that you wanted to tell and couldn't quite figure out how to get it in there, or that you wanted to have it fit in with everything else in a way that made narrative sense?
I mean, the trickiest thing in this one was to figure out when to bring Scott into the story, because if we bring him in too early, you sort of kill some of the mystery of discovering that there's this guy out there that knew all this stuff this whole time. Part of the thing with this story is that accidents happened that uncovered new information about the case, so it kind of kept getting reopened in a weird way.
Mm-hmm.
So once we figured out where to bring Scott in, then the next thing was, the trick was to figure out how to continue weaving him and the story moving forward at the same time, because he doesn't come into it till much later.
Well, Allison, one of the interesting things to me is, in some ways, this is sort of the mirror image of a Laurel Canyon documentary. It's the same area, it's some crossover with people, but it might as well be a different part of the world.
Yeah, we had just finished doing the Laurel Canyon series when we started development on this, and I always thought of this series as being the negative image, not the mirror image, but the negative image of what had come before it.
Michael, as you're sitting on camera and you're sort of doing these interviews, you talked about it not being something that you're used to doing. Is something that you would like to do more of? I mean, does this make you think, what, there are some other stories I'd like to tell on camera because I have a voice, I have a knowledge of this is maybe unique to the situation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I started down this path when I started doing podcasts, and that all came out of, I was happy as a clam, just writing my novels and so forth. And I think there's some reportage in my novels. I go for as much realism and facts as I can, but at the end of the day, it's a novel, and maybe it grew out of the whole fake news era. But I wanted to tell truth. I suddenly started wanting to go back to telling true stories, and it wasn't like I could go back to start writing the daily crime beat. So I started down with podcasts, and then this came about. Allison wanted me on camera, and we're talking about other stuff we'd like to do. And so I've kind of left the podcast behind, And then I think the next move I will make is to be involved in more documentaries. And if I'm on camera, that's okay. If I'm not, I still think we can tell some really good stories about Los Angeles. I'm still focused on Los Angeles and, the subhead of our thing, the secret history of Hollywood. There's a lot to say about that and a lot more stories to tell about that.
Well, let me follow up with that, and then I'll sort of ask you the same questions as well too, Allison, is that when you're doing true crime projects, the audience, at least a portion of the audience, is very focused on the details. True crime fans are sometimes pretty obsessive about what they believe the story is. I suspect that maybe you get a little less pushback when you're writing a novel than on a true crime project where someone says, well, I happened to talk to some random detective and that's not what he told me and you're wrong. And what's it like sort of dealing with that type of an audience that there's some passionate people out there who are true crime fans who like this idea of maybe I can solve this in a way that no one else has.
That to Michael?
Yeah, either one of you want to tackle it.
Well, I'll start by quickly saying, hey, have at it. There are loose ends to this crime, and we leave it as saying people got away with murder. So, it's 40 plus years later, so it's going to be hard to bring anybody to justice at this point. We kind of touched on that with the head of the cold case unit. But I mean, I really love the idea that we're dropping this into that world of people who will take it further and discuss it and maybe come up with some new ideas. So, my answer is have at it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story that has been told multiple times, but we've put together, as Michael said earlier, we've put together pieces that I don't think anyone's ever connected to this, thus far anyway. And maybe there are more pieces to put together still. So
yeah, I think we have a higher resonance on this when we talk about the secret history of Hollywood and how this little microcosm, if you will, of this bad guy Eddie Nash and what he was doing with Scott Thorson and how it had ways, into the crack epidemic and things that really tore through our society. And I think this thing is what we're presenting here gives a greater understanding of how that happened.
Well, one of the things that was obviously for, I suspect, legal reasons, if nothing else, that was just briefly touched on, but I found super fascinating, and I thought, I want to hear more about this, was the whole idea of Hollywood sets and building into the budget for cocaine and the Grizzly Adams, which I remember that arrest, at least. And that's one of those stories that I don't think most people really think about, particularly for that time period, that everyone knew what was going on and the money got passed around. And I think most people don't really think of their favorite movie or TV show from that era being driven by cocaine.
well, a lot of them were.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was. I mean, we mentioned that, and it's not a big focus of that.
Yeah,
we're talking about a project where that would become a greater focus, I think.
let me wrap it up this way, and I'll ask you first, Michael, and then you, Allison. What do you hope that people sort of take away from this? I mean, it certainly is a story from that particular time in Hollywood, but is there some lesson that people could draw that would sort of give them an idea of what Hollywood is like in 2024?
Well, I mean, I do think what stands out to me is the perseverance of detectives. And as I said, that's kind of what I've been exploring in fiction and also in journalism going way back for my whole career. Why am I stuck on that? I don't really know, but it inspires me when people, kind of take this bargain where they're going to do their best. And it might not solve the case. It might draw jeers from some people in society, but they take that deal and they pursue things that are, they go into darkness. And if you go into darkness as a matter of course in your job, some of that's going to get into you. And I think we see varying degrees of it with these detectives we interviewed. But to me, is a kind of a heroic story, a noble story. And I hope that comes out of this. But as I said before, I also hope this is this kind of gives some understanding as to what happened in our society. I mean, people, you know, you got to be of a certain age to remember, but if you do remember the crack epidemic and the thousands and thousands of lives laid to waste by it, this kind of gives you an understanding of how that happened.
Well, let me wrap up with you, Allison. The same thing. What do you think, aside from the telling of this particular story, what do you hope that viewers take away from this?
I think it's the peeling back of the veneer of Hollywood and what we look at as celebrity stars, whether it be nightclub owners or Liberace or whatever, that when you peel back the veneer, there can be darkness driving things. And as Michael said, the minute that darkness catches hold, it just burrows in.
Well, thanks to both of you. Really enjoyed it. You
Great.
know, I was living in LA during that period, so it's interesting to sort of look back on that for me. And it was really well done. Really liked it a lot. Thanks a lot.
Great. Thank
Thank
you.
you.